Hi everyone, and welcome to another video review. In this video I'm going to share my initial impressions of the Sony A1 Mark II now that I've had about a month time to shoot with this camera. And I'm going to share what I think about it and whether it's really better than the original A1 or not for photographing birds, and especially birds in flight. So let's dive in. So to test the Sony A1 II, especially the autofocus performance and other improvements, I chose Northern Harrier as my primary subject. Why Northern Harrier? A couple of reasons. First of all, I like these birds. They're, in my opinion, pretty handsome raptors, and they can make great photographs, especially when the light is nice. And I'm going to share some of these photos so you can take a look at them later. And the other reason is that I've shot this species with many different camera systems over the years, going back about 2 decades, starting with the Canon DSLR system in the mid-thousands, all the way to the Sony mirrorless system now. So I have a lot of experience with different camera systems shooting the same species in the same location, so I can basically form a better opinion comparing similar circumstances. The other reason is that these birds are quite challenging for the autofocus system. They don't fly that fast, like they're not going to fly as fast as a peregrine or a Cooper's hawk, but they're very erratic and they fly really close to the ground. So most autofocus systems historically struggle to keep the focus on the bird because they sometimes disappear behind the marshes or bushes and then they pop back up, and their flight trajectory is completely random and erratic. They could be going right and then suddenly they go left. They're going like straight and suddenly they go down, they stop, and they do all kinds of very strange and sudden maneuvers when they're flying, because they usually come down on a mouse from above and basically use their talons to grab the prey. And the other reason is that, we talk about machine learning and AI autofocus. So most people try to photograph like songbirds, but probably that's not a great test for AI-based autofocus system, because the system is probably trained on songbirds. Songbirds are easy to find everywhere. You can put a feeder and have them come in and come out, so you can take like millions of shots of songbirds and train the autofocus system on those. But Northern Harrier, especially male species, you're not going to find them that easily to train the autofocus system in the wild, unless they're captive, which doesn't quite work. So it's kind of more of a sort of like a new subject for the autofocus system to see how it can perform for something that it hasn't been necessarily specifically trained for. That's another reason. And also, they're sort of like medium-sized raptors, and they're very, very, very skittish. There's no way you can get close to a wild harrier in the wild without using some kind of like hide or something like that. So I don't have any of those. I can't take a hide with me. So what I use is long focal lengths, 1200 millimeters. That's the 600 with the 2x, or the 600 with 1.4. So that's also a little bit more challenging for the autofocus system to track at those really long focal lengths. Like, you're really sensitive to panning and everything. So it's kind of a good challenging condition to put arguably the best camera to a really challenging test. I'm going to share my findings with you now. Now, before I dive into the autofocus comparison between the A1 and the A1 II, I want to talk a little bit about the Sony nomenclature. It's pretty confusing. That's why we explained that in the guide. And that's the difference between tracking and non-tracking autofocus modes. Both of these focus modes are meant to track a subject. So what is the difference? The difference is in tracking mode, the camera initially registers the subject that is inside the selected focus pattern, and then it attempts to track that. So after the subject is registered, the user has pretty much no control over what the camera is doing. The camera will just attempt to follow that initially registered subject across the frame, no matter where it is, and when it loses, it often just like randomly selects something or latches to the background, and basically user doesn't have any control anymore. It's hard to reset it. But in non-tracking, the camera always looks what is inside the selected autofocus pattern and tries to follow that. So as you're panning with the subject, if you keep the focus pattern on the subject, the camera is going to continue focusing on that, and it's not going to randomly shift the focus to somewhere else in the background or somewhere else in the frame. It always looks what you have inside of the autofocus pattern, for example the zone pattern, and tries to focus and track that, so it gives user much more control over what the camera is doing. Now on top of that, the camera has subject recognition. So when the subject recognition is enabled, it will try to identify the subject based on the subject type that you've enabled or you've selected. The different subjects that it can recognize are bird, human, animal, train, plane, car, etc. So if you have enabled one of these or all of them, for example, when it sees a car in the frame, it will just grab the car and latch onto the car and track the car no matter where it's in the frame. So in other words, it ignores what focus pattern you've chosen before. It just latches onto the subject and tracks the subject wherever that subject is. So it takes precedence over the focus pattern, or whether it's tracking or non-tracking that you've selected before. If it loses recognition, meaning that it can no longer identify that subject, it reverts back to the pattern that you'd selected before. So to capture northern harriers, the best autofocus setup for both the A1 and A1 Mark II is to use the so-called non-tracking zone mode. I explained this in detail in the Sony Art and Science of Bird Photography guide that I wrote with Arthur Morris. We go in depth about like why to use certain kinds of autofocus modes for different species, but for harriers, typically using the non-tracking zone, I find that for both of the cameras it performs the best, because these birds are highly camouflaged. Their feather patterns are one-to-one match for the backgrounds, the type of backgrounds and the location I shoot. So that often confuses the tracking mode autofocus if it's going, you know, against like a really dry shrub or dry brush. Sometimes it gets basically the focus will go all over the place. But the zone non-tracking often does a really good job of holding on to the bird, and for both cameras that's the mode that performs the best overall for photographing these birds. One of the differences or the questions that I guess I get asked from people is that whether the subject detection works better in the A1 and in A1 II compared to A1. So subject detection can be active regardless of the focus mode. So whether you're in non-tracking mode or tracking mode, the subject detection works the same. They're basically trying to identify the subject in the non-tracking mode or tracking mode. If it identifies the subject, that gets priority. So it's just going to go for the subject no matter what. When it loses the subject, that's when the non-tracking zone mode performs better than the tracking zone mode, because the tracking zone may just wobble around, just randomly pick something, but the non-tracking zone mode, I find that you have better chances of getting back on the bird after you lose it for whatever reason. So the first question is that whether the subject recognition works better in the A1 II. So in the A1 II, you have the option to select which part of the particular subject you want the camera to identify first, and which one it wants to put a higher priority on. For birds, it has three choices. It's basically eye, and then head, and then the body. So ideally you always wanted to grab the eye, but you know, maybe sometimes the eye is too small, or it's looking the other way, or it's in the shadow, whatever, so I can't identify that. Then ideally you would want to go for the head. And then the third one is body. You often don't want the focus to be on the body necessarily, because depending on how far the bird is, then the head might be outside of depth of field. So that's kind of like something that it's kind of like a double-edged sword. So if the bird is far, yeah, sure, like if you don't find anything, it's good to grab the body. You still get most of the bird in focus. But if it's close and it suddenly identifies the body but not the head and not the eye for whatever reason, and focuses like on the chest area, then the head's going to be out of focus. So I tried these modes to see how they work for this particular species, and I find that in terms of detecting the eye for something like a northern harrier, the A1 II and A1 are somewhat similar, which is the same conclusion that I had for the A9 III as well. That for these kind of birds that I like to shoot, not songbirds, not like birds that are very common, but like exotic raptors, kind of raptors that you don't see often. They both, from close range, they both can detect the eye most of the time, but when it's flying, most of the time it won't be able to grab the eye from the rest of the bird, even when it's flying in relatively close distance. And basically in that case, in the A1, it will just revert to the regular zone and it will track the bird. Most you will see a couple of focus points active. They're usually around the head area or the neck area, that area, so that's like that. With the A1 II, I found that if you have the body option selected in the recognition settings, there are many times that it can identify the bird, like it basically draws like a rectangular frame around the bird, even though it doesn't find the eye. And in those situations, it does a little bit better in the sense that it's usually not really easy to lose focus once it grabs it with the A1 II. It's usually like really sticky unless it's completely gone out of the frame, or it's like behind bushes or something for like a second or two. Then it basically loses it. But I find that the subject recognition, in terms of recognizing that it's a bird, that part is a little bit better. Granted, A1 doesn't actually have that mode. A1 is either bird eye or nothing. So when it doesn't see the bird eye, it basically doesn't see any bird. It just goes by motion and other factors, which is quite effective too for A1. But this one is just a little bit better because it can recognize that this is a bird. I don't know where the eye is or the head is, but this looks like a bird, so I'm gonna just keep the focus in that area. So it's a little bit better. It's not day and night by any means, but it is a little bit better in that sense. Now, can you translate that to an increased keeper ratio? Like, let's say you shoot 100 frames with the A1 and A1 II side by side. Is this always going to get you like 10% more shots? That's not the case, because the A1 is really so good that really to improve on that in some kind of a measurable way, it's really difficult because it's 95% there, and this one maybe it's 98% there. So that little bit, that 3%, is not really easy to quantify and easy to basically observe in any shooting session. But overall, it does feel like it is more sticky when it comes to these kind of situations, or the bird is like exactly like the background and it's very erratic. It has a kind of an easier time sticking to it. So that's one thing, that first observation about the A1 II compared to A1. Now, one of the nice things that the A1 II has is the ability to retain the focus pattern but switch between tracking and non-tracking with programming a custom function. So you can program a custom function to a button. When you press it, let's say you're in tracking zone, it will retain the zone pattern, but it will switch to non-tracking zone. So for example, if you like to use zone tracking most of the time, but suddenly there's a situation where it doesn't work very well and you want to keep the zone but you want to disable tracking feature, you can just press a button and it will do that. And that's something really helpful because as I mentioned, the tracking patterns don't really work very well when you have really busy backgrounds and sort of like erratic subjects, but it works well when the background is really uniform, like a sky or something very far. So you may want to use the zone with tracking and then switch to non-tracking as the bird flies from like a clear background into like a busy background. So you can just press a button on the fly and it will do that, and that's something that you cannot do with the A1. And that goes along with the customization, the higher degree of customization that this camera offers for the autofocus system. Um, Now moving on, the most, I would say, important thing that the A1 II brings to the table that the A1 doesn't have is that pre-capture. So the pre-capture basically buffers a number of shots. You can set in the menu. It's basically controlled by time duration actually. So if you set your camera to 30 frames a second and you set the pre-capture time to half a second, that means it will record up to 15 frames prior to releasing the shutter. So when you half press the shutter, it starts buffering continuously, and once you full press the shutter, it takes the first shot and then it grabs the last 15 frames at 30 frames a second to give you that half a second of pre-capture. And this one, I feel like it is making a difference, especially for the takeoff shots. Not so much for the flight shots. I think I mentioned this earlier. Flight shots, when you see a bird flying, you aim, you center, and you start shooting. So there is really no like pre-capture per se. It's even, as soon as you pick up, you're shooting. There's no pre. But for bird taking off of a perch, it is very useful. Granted that you have the patience to like stay there and wait and wait and wait and wait until the bird takes off. If you give up, yeah, obviously you miss it. But if you are waiting and you still gotta be fast enough to kind of synchronize and press the shutter about the same time the bird's taking off. If you wait a second or two, recapture is not gonna help. But if you're right on it, but you're just missing it by half a second, which is usually what happens because our reaction time is not as fast as a bird. The bird, it's like instantly it's gone. Even I guess the most fastest reflexes of a human probably won't be able to keep up with that. So this helps to capture the peak of the action or peak of takeoff frame. We'll see some examples in my the slideshow that I put together for this video. Peak of takeoff frame is really easy to capture with this camera. If you're on it, you will have that frame no matter what. With the A1, it's kind of 50-50. Sometimes you're fast and you kind of like preemptively start just an instant before it takes off and then you get that frame, but sometimes by the time you press, it's already too late. So that's a really big advantage in favor of the A1 II for those takeoff shots, whether it's taking off from a setup perch or taking off in the wild. I find that it's making a difference. Like, you can definitely take shots with this that you're not sure whether the A1 would have taken those or not, just because of the pre-capture. Now, one thing about pre-capture is that you have to use it with care because it can eat the memory really fast. So I've configured a button on my camera to turn it on and off on demand, so when I'm not shooting anything that's perched or I'm expecting it to fly, I don't waste a lot of memory. Like, I have to delete those shots later, because a lot of times, sometimes you're using your camera to just track something, and then there's like a situation where you want to grab 1 or 2 frames only. It's like a slower bird or whatever. If you have pre-capture on, you end up with 60-70 frames, and then you have to later delete those. So, and it eats the memory really fast. So I have it set up with a custom button. You can do that in the menu to turn it on and off on demand. So whenever you don't need it, you can turn it off, so you don't end up eating your memory. In terms of image quality between the A1 II and the A1, there aren't any differences. I did a control test. I'll share the results. They're virtually indistinguishable from another. It's the same 50 megapixel sensor, which is great for shooting birds. I love it because it gives me the ability to crop and still have a lot of details and make files that I can roll up on a 4K screen and view at large size and enjoy the details. So that's great. There are no surprises there, basically. Another thing I wanted to talk about is the differences in the viewfinder. So this A1 II has the same resolution viewfinder as the A1, with basically this 3 settings that the A1 had for frame rate. Is normal, high, and highest. And normal is 60 hertz, I believe. High is 120 hertz, and the highest is 240 hertz. And with the A1, basically, if you choose a higher frame rate, the resolution drops. Going from normal to high, the resolution drops, and going from high to highest, what it does is that it can't refresh all the pixels, so it puts like a black frame around and the image shrinks, which is the same as resolution dropping. So it has limitations when you go to high and highest. And the other thing that people have observed with the A1 is that, and also the A9 III, is when you engage the continuous focusing, the focus tracking, you will see artifacts in the viewfinder like shimmering and aliasing. So it seems like the resolution also drops in those cases, or the image processing pipeline in the viewfinder is not able to keep up. So the viewfinder quality drops to some extent when you're engaging the continuous focus, which is one of the drawbacks of the A1. Now with the A1 II, it still has the same refresh rate versus resolution trade-off. As you go from normal to highest, you'll see first resolution drop, and then again the black frame and shrinking of the image, so that part is the same. And then also when you engage autofocus tracking focus, you will see a little bit of shimmering and aliasing artifacts, which indicates something in the viewfinder pipeline is not able to keep up, so they have to reduce the resolution or whatnot. But for what I find with this one is that for the high mode, so that's under 20 hertz, the quality drop is less significant than it is with the A1. It's really hard to quantify it, because to capture the actual image you see through the EVF, you have to put a special optics behind the EVF to capture that image, and you have to basically engage the autofocus. It's very difficult to somewhat test that and put it on in a video. Maybe I'll find a way to do it, but it feels like for the middle mode, which is 120 hertz or high frame rate, the A1 II has less of a image quality degradation. It is there, so if you look at a dense pattern and you half press the shutter, you can still see a little bit of shimmering and aliasing. If you're looking for it, you will see it, but it's not significant that it basically distracts from the experience, or it dulls the experience for you. It's acceptable, and usually when you're in the field and you're focused on capturing images and focused on your subject, you won't notice it. You won't think about it, and you won't notice it. So for this one, I mainly use the high frame rate with the viewfinder, and that's the mode I like to use. With the A1, I was mostly using the highest, which is 240 hertz. It's a little bit smoother for panning, but the image was too small, so I always kind of like, when I look through compared to shooting with those DSLRs that have really large and bright finders, I was always a little bit I guess not as happy, because the image was, viewfinder image was a little small, and that's because I did not really like the high mode on the A1 when I engaged the continuous focus, which is all the time. So I basically just said, okay, I'm going to use the 240 hertz, and the image is a little smaller. But with this one, I ended up using the high mode, and it seems like it's the best balance for this camera. So there is a little bit of improvement there. Again, it's really hard to quantify, and Sony also, they don't really quantify when they say the high mode has improved. They don't say by how much or exactly what, they just say it's better. So it is better. Again, none of these are like day and night differences, but there is some improvement there, so you may find that you like the high mode now and use that most of the time. The normal mode, which is the highest resolution, when you half press to engage continuous focus, you do see the image quality drop on that in some cases. So I'm not sure if it's any better than the A1 or not, because again, it's really hard to compare, but it is still there. Another aspect that I think has improved quite a bit in A1 II relative to the A1 is the image stabilizer. So these cameras have sensor-based image stabilizer, so the sensor shifts to reduce the blur from handshake, and it works in tandem with the optical stabilizer in the lens. For example, this 300-28 has its own optical stabilizer, and that works with the sensor stabilizer. With the Sony cameras, A1 and also the A9 II that I had for some time, I found that the stabilizer is actually overall quite poor compared to both Nikon and Canon image stabilizers that I've been using for prior to this for about 2 decades. With those cameras, I could easily handhold the 600 millimeter and get like at least 50% sharp shots at some like 1/400 of a second. Not that I use that in the field because that speed is too slow for birds and you're gonna get blur anyway. But you know, for sometimes you want to take some telephoto landscapes. Sometimes you just want to shoot in low light and you don't have a tripod, and it's nice to have good stabilizer. You know, it's part of what you pay for. And I found that the stabilizers were not really that great. It was working, but it wasn't anything like 3 or 4 stops. With this camera, they have promised to improve the image stabilizer. I don't know what their official claim is. It's probably some ridiculous like 5 stops better or something like that. But I've noticed that the stabilizer is indeed better. So, for example, with this 300 to 8, if I shoot at 1/150th of a second, I can probably get most of the sharp shot. Versus with the original A1, if I do that, I would say it's very rare to get even one shot sharp. So there is definitely an improvement in the image stabilizer in this compared to the A1. So if you want to shoot a lot of handheld, low light, slow shutter speeds, obviously stationary subjects, because if subject is moving, the stabilizer is not going to help with that. But if you do, telephoto landscapes, things like that, this one is also better for that. The stabilizer is much better. This is a test of the buffer capacity with the A1 Mark II, and pre-capture is enabled for zero point 0.4 seconds. So it's shooting now at 30 frames a second and keeps going. The vertical bar on the left side shows the remaining buffer. Keeps going, keeps going. It's more than 10 seconds already. And that's it. Let's see how many shots were recorded. So 406. Now, in terms of competition, when the original Sony A1 came out, it really didn't have any competition because there was no other 50 megapixel full frame camera on the market that could do 30 frames a second RAW with the kind of autofocus system that the A1 had. So it was basically one of a kind. Now, I consider Nikon to be a relatively strong competitor to Sony in this space. Especially Nikon has a really strong portfolio of long lenses, super telephoto lenses. They have the 600 f4, but with the integrated TC, which makes it really easy to engage and disengage the TC. You don't have to basically take out the whole lens at the TC and then mount it back. That's a pain. It's like flip of a switch, you can do that. And they also have these like high-end high quality but compact lenses that currently Sony doesn't have. Sony only has this 300-8 and 600 f4 for bird photography. If you want the best premium quality lenses, these are kind of pretty much the only options you have. But Nikon has more options there. And their Z8 and Z9 bodies, they're kind of closer to this. The Sony A1 II doesn't come with an integrated grip, so you can add on the grip. That's a nice thing, but you have to buy that grip. But if you compare it with something with the Z9 that already has a grip, or with the Z8 that also has interchangeable grip, but that camera is significantly cheaper than this. The thing is that the difference between the two is that 30 frames a second RAW is one difference. So those cameras don't do RAW. They do 30 frames a second, I believe even faster in like JPEGs and other things. But if you want 30 frames a second RAW, this camera and the A1 are the only ones that currently do that, 50 megapixel. And the autofocus system on that camera, I've tried it a few times, not extensively. And while the autofocus is good, it's not quite the same as the A1 or A1 II level. When for photographing birds, I don't shoot other subjects, so I don't know about other things. Maybe sports is different. But for birds in flight, they're not quite the same as the A1. It's not that they're bad, they can get plenty of great shots. You can look online, you know, there's plenty of awesome shots with those two. But just as a tool, I believe that the A1 and A1 II still have the best overall autofocus performance if you want to capture birds in flight, especially varied backgrounds and raptors and that kind of stuff. It just works better. It gives you more a higher percentage of shots that are sharply focused. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But there is a big difference in price between the two. Is that worth it or not? Again, you have to answer that question yourself. If you want the best, this is probably it. But what if you want the second best for a lot cheaper? That's up to you. You know, you can compare. Canon, not so much, mainly because their long lenses haven't really been updated for the mirrorless technology. They just add a physical adapter to the lens, and basically they're selling the same 600 Mark III that they've had for like a decade now. Same lens that they made for DSLR, they're selling that. And their flagship camera is 20 megapixels, and that's more comparable with the A9 III, but A9 III shoots at 120 frames a second, so it's really very little comparison there in terms of spec. They're, I believe, the same price. So yeah, Nikon is the alternative in my opinion to the Sony system for photographing birds and birds in flight. So they have more lenses, but if you want the best body, it's probably still the A1 and A1 II. Now in terms of price, one thing that I noted is that the A1 II is $6,500. It's the same as the A1 was dollar-wise in 2021 or 2020. So given inflation, it actually is cheaper. It's cheaper today than the A1 was when it came out. And it's a better camera, you know. Whichever way you think about it, it is better. It's better or equal. Some things are equal, some things are better. So they're giving you a better camera for a lower adjusted price, which is a great thing. It's still not cheap, and I also think that they should have, at this price, included the vertical grip, but they don't. So in absolute terms, I think it is a little bit on the pricey side, but relatively speaking, I think the price is great actually, because if you think about it, in 2012, I believe I paid $6,500 for a Canon 1DX DSLR, and in today's money, that would be, I don't know, $13,000, $14,000, and that camera, there's no comparison with the technology in this. So Moore's law is still valid for cameras, and basically you get a lot for your money these days. So yeah, face value, it's a little high, but relatively speaking, I think it's actually not a bad price at all. Okay, so what is my final verdict on the Sony A1 II? Is it better than the A1? Yes, the A1 II has pre-capture. It has a more flexible autofocus system that can be fine-tuned in many more ways than the A1. It has a slightly better viewfinder. It has pretty good buffer depth, as I showed. It has a better LCD screen for reviewing your images, and overall it's more ergonomic. It fits in your hand better. It has an extra programmable button on the front. So should you go ahead and upgrade? It depends on whether you plan or you like to take a lot of takeoff shots. If you do want to take a lot of takeoff shots, then the pre-capture in this one is a game changer. It is much easier to grab the peak of takeoff frame using pre-capture with this one than it is with the A1. With the A1 is more or less luck of a draw. Like, it depends whether you're faster or the bird, and there's no guarantee that you're gonna get the best frame. But with this one, it's almost guaranteed as long as you stay on it. If you don't want to take a lot of takeoff shots, still the A1 II is an upgrade. But it's an upgrade that you should consider. It's not just go ahead and upgrade. You have to weigh in whether the extra cost is worth it for you or not, because the difference is not day and night. But there are all of those improvements that I mentioned. Now, to get the best from the autofocus technology that's in these cameras, whether it's A1 II or A1 or A9 III, I highly recommend that you go over the guide that Arthur Morrison wrote, The Art and Science of Photographing Birds in Flight with Sony. Has a lot of detailed information that teaches you how to use these cameras, and it can help you greatly improve your skills. With that, thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next video.